The purse was Spanish leather, dyed the color of claret, and it landed on the tablecloth between the toast rack and the butter dish, with a sound like a hand laid flat against a desk. Not thrown, placed. The Dowager Duchess of Worley had never thrown anything in her life. Thea looked at it the way one might look at a second fork laid at a setting that required only one, with mild interest briefly before returning to her plate. 300 pounds, the Dowager said. She remained standing. She had not removed her gloves. The visit, her posture announced, would not require sitting. Enough to establish yourself quietly. A cottage near Lyme or Bath if you prefer society. A modest annuity can be arranged through my solicitor once the separation is formalized. The breakfast room at Worley Court caught the morning from two directions. East-facing windows threw long rectangles of May sunlight across the floor, and the south bay held a cushioned seat where Thea sometimes read after the meal was cleared. At this hour, the room was luminous, white linen, white china edged in cobalt, a crystal jug of water refracting small rainbows across the sideboard. The Dowager stood in the middle of all this brightness like a column of gray stone. Thea cut a triangle of toast in half. She did this with a precision that suggested the task required her full attention. She placed one half on the edge of her plate and lifted the other. "I have discussed the matter with Mr. Jessup," the Dowager continued. Mr. Jessup was her personal solicitor, separate from the family's man of law, and Thea had met him once. A thin person with excellent handwriting, who had witnessed the marriage settlement without meeting anyone's eye. "The terms are generous, more than generous. They reflect my desire that this be done cleanly, without spectacle." Thea spread a thin layer of marmalade. The marmalade was civil orange, made by Mrs. Curran's kitchen in January from fruit that arrived in wooden crates packed with straw. Thea had overseen the order herself. She remembered the scent of boiling peel filling the ground floor corridor, the way the kitchen girl's hands had been stained amber for days afterward. She had stood at the kitchen door, watching the jars being sealed with wax, and Mrs. Curran had offered her a spoon to taste the first batch, and she had taken it, and it had been good. "You will understand," the Dowager said, and here her voice acquired the particular quality it carried when she believed she was being reasonable, a tone both patient and faintly compressed, as though wisdom were being dispensed through a narrow opening. "That I do not say this from malice. I say it because the situation has become untenable." Thea bit into her toast. The situation, as the Dowager understood it, had been untenable since the morning Benedict had informed her of his intentions. That had been 19 months ago, January of the previous year, in the Dare House morning room, with frost on the windows, and the fire not yet built up. He had come early before breakfast, which the Dowager should have recognized as significant, because Benedict did nothing before breakfast unless he considered it urgent. He had stood by the mantelpiece and said, "I have proposed to Miss Sedley, and she has accepted." And the Dowager had set down her teacup with a care that concealed everything beneath it, and said, "Which Miss Sedley?" Though she knew perfectly well which, because there was only one, because the Sedleys of Harrowden had produced a single daughter, brown-haired, gray-eyed, angular, the granddaughter of a country parson on her father's side, and of a minor baronet's younger son on her mother's. And the Dowager had spent the 3 months prior watching Benedict pay calls on that household with increasing frequency, and hoping it was the mother's piano he admired, and not the daughter's conversation. It was the daughter's conversation. Thea Sedley had met Benedict Langdale at the autumn assembly in North Allerton, where she had been standing near the window with a glass of Rhenish. She was not drinking, watching the dancing with an expression that Benedict later described to his steward, Hollis, as interested but unconvinced. He had asked her to dance. She had said, "I do not dance particularly well," which was true. He had said, "Neither do I," which was also true. They had danced anyway, badly. And he had called her the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And by Christmas he had understood that what he felt in her company was not attraction. Attraction was simpler, quicker, less structural, but recognition. She thought the way he thought. She noticed the things he noticed. She asked the questions he had not yet formulated. When she disagreed with him, which was often, she did so with a precision that made him grateful rather than defensive, and this was so unusual in his experience of the world that he could not imagine returning to a life organized without it. The Dowager's opposition had moved through phases. First, silence at the wedding itself, held in the chapel at Worley Court on a morning of hard March sunlight, where the Dowager had sat in the front pew and spoken to no one, and departed before the breakfast. Then formality, correct, impeccable, and so cold it burned. She addressed Thea as Your Grace, with a scrupulousness that made the title sound borrowed. She attended dinners when required, sat in the drawing room when expected, and answered direct questions with a brevity that was itself a form of speech. She never raised her voice. She never needed to. The silence was louder. Then came the whisper campaign. Thea learned of it in pieces from Mrs. Curran, who heard it from the dower house cook, who heard it from the Dowager's lady's maid. The Dowager had written to Lady Colborne, to the Countess of Petton, to her sister in Berkshire. The letters were carefully worded. They did not defame. They expressed concern. They mentioned the Sedley family's modest circumstances. They noted with regret that the young Duchess lacked the connections one might wish for. They deployed the phrase, "I am sure she is very good," which in the Dowager's vocabulary meant the opposite of good, and everyone who read it understood this. Thea knew about the letters. She said nothing. Benedict knew about the letters. He said nothing to Thea and something brief and furious to his mother, and the letters stopped. The whisper campaign did not. It simply moved from paper to parlor, from ink to inflection, and the Dowager's drawing room became a place where Thea's name was spoken, with a particular emphasis that communicated everything the letters had contained. Through all of this, Thea managed the house. She consulted with Hollis on drainage. She reviewed the tenant rolls with a diligence that surprised him and a memory that astounded him. She oversaw the kitchen, the linen, the candles, the coal orders, the quarterly accounts. She visited the sick in the parish with Mrs. Curran, carrying broth and blankets in the gig, and she sat with old Mrs. Jessup, no relation to the Dowager's solicitor, for 2 hours while the woman died, holding her hand and reading aloud from a book of Psalms, because Mrs. Jessup's daughter was in York and could not come. She did these things not to prove anything. She did them because they needed doing and because she was capable of doing them, and because competence to Thea was not a performance but a condition, the way breathing was a condition, or seeing. And now the Dowager had placed a purse on the table. 300, the final escalation, the step beyond whispers and silence and cold formality into something transactional and bare. Buy her out. Remove her. Make her disappear. As though 14 months of marriage and competence in quiet transformation of the household could be undone with gold coins in a cottage near Lyme. Thea finished her toast. She reached for the water jug and poured herself a glass. Then she picked up the purse. The Dowager's chin lifted a fraction, a movement so small it might have been involuntary, and set it on the table between them. Not pushed back, not tossed, set down. The way one sets down a book one does not intend to read, with a care that makes the disinterest worse. "The eggs are very good this morning," Thea said. "Will you sit?" The Dowager did not sit. She stood for another 4 seconds. Thea counted them by the mantel clock's tick, because by now she had learned to count things in the Dowager's presence, to measure silences, and weigh glances the way one weighs flour, precisely so that nothing collapsed. And then she turned and left the breakfast room. Her footsteps crossed the hall. The front door opened and closed. Gravel crunched under carriage wheels. Thea set down her fork. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling. Not her voice, not her expression. Her hands beneath the table, where no one could have seen them, were shaking badly enough that the fork tapped twice against the plate's edge when she released it. She pressed both palms flat against her lap and breathed until they stilled. The purse sat on the white tablecloth in the morning light, claret dark and glossy, and neither Mrs. Curran, nor the footman James, nor the girl who came to clear the toast rack touched it. They moved around it the way water moves around a stone in a stream, naturally without comment, as though it had always been there. Benedict found it at 10:30. He had been riding since 7, a habit formed in the years after his father's death, when the estate had required more attention than his education had prepared him to give, and the saddle had become the one place where the ledgers could not follow. He came into the breakfast room smelling of horse and cold air. His riding coat darkened at the shoulders with dew, and he saw the purse before he saw anything else. He did not pick it up. He stood in the doorway looking at it, the way a man looks at a document he already knows the contents of, and then he looked at Mrs. Curran, who was replacing the coffee urn. "Her Grace was here," Mrs. Curran said, meaning the elder Her Grace. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. "How long?" "A quarter of an hour. Your Grace, perhaps less." "And the Duchess in the morning room." "She asked for fresh tea at 10 o'clock. Benedict crossed to the table. He picked up the purse. He could feel the weight of coin through the leather, not banknotes, which would have been lighter and more discreet, but gold, which was heavier and more deliberate. His mother had chosen gold because gold made a sound when it landed, because gold was physical in a way that paper was not, because she wanted the weight of the offer to be felt in the hand. He opened the drawstring and looked inside. He closed it again. He left the breakfast room without eating. He rode to the dower house, which sat a mile and a half across the park, stone-fronted and ivy-clad, and smaller than its occupant believed she deserved. And he found his mother in the morning room, with her correspondence spread across the writing desk like evidence. "I will say this once," Benedict said. He had not sat. He had not been invited to sit. "If you approach her again with money, with terms, with solicitors, with conditions of any kind, I will close this house. I will remove the staff. I will settle your income at the legal minimum the marriage settlement requires, and not a shilling beyond it. And I will do it quietly so that no one in society knows why, only that it has been done." The dowager set down her pen. "You are speaking from emotion. I'm speaking from clarity. She has made you believe she is more than she is. Benedict, a country parson's granddaughter. Her mother was adequate, I grant you. The Sedleys were respectable, but adequate is not sufficient for what this family requires. What this family requires," Benedict said, "is precisely what she has given it. Competence, composure, a household that functions, tenants who are heard. Do not confuse what you want with what is needed. She wanted the continuation of a name. Then you should be grateful. She had given you that too." He meant the pregnancy, early as it was, 2 months, perhaps 10 weeks, which Thea had told him 3 days before. In their bedchamber, the curtains open, the evening light catching the copper in her hair. She had told him simply, without ceremony, and his response had been to take her hand and hold it for a long time without speaking, because the words that came to him were all inadequate, and he had learned from her that silence could carry what language could not. The dowager did not know. She would not know for weeks yet, until the quickening made discretion impossible, and by then the ground between them would have shifted in ways she could not reverse. Benedict left the dower house. He did not tell Thea what he had said. This was both instinct and error, the withholding, the management of her situation without her knowledge. He would come to understand it only months later, when she told him that protection offered without consultation was just another kind of purse laid on a table. The words struck him like cold water, not because they were unkind, but because they were exact. And after that he did not shield her from anything without asking first. But that lesson was ahead of him, for now he rode home through the park, past the lake where the willows were just beginning to green, past the south meadow where the tenant children were flying a kite, made from brown paper and hazel sticks, past the walled garden where the first roses of the year were opening in colors his mother would have been able to name, and he could not. The estate was beautiful in May. He had known this abstractly for years, had seen it in the ledgers as value, in the surveys as acreage. But Thea had taught him to see it as a thing that was alive, a thing that required not just management, but attention, the way a marriage required not just fidelity, but presence. He had been faithful. He was learning to be present. He found his wife in the morning room reading a treatise on the rotation of root crops, because Thea read everything and retained most of it, and had, in 14 months of marriage, come to understand the estate's tendencies better than the steward, Hollis, who had served the family for 19 years. He did not resent this, because she had never once made him feel supplanted. She had simply asked questions, remembered the answers, and followed up. Hollis had told Mrs. Curran, in the servants' hall, that the new Duchess reminded him of good drainage. You did not notice it until you saw what happened without it. Thea looked up when Benedict entered. She saw the mud on his boots, the set of his jaw, the way his gloves were crushed in his left hand rather than drawn off properly. She understood that he had been to the dower house. She did not ask what had been said. "The purse is still on the breakfast table," she said. "I know. I would like it to remain there." He looked at her. "For how long?" "Until I decide what it means." This was the quality in Thea that had drawn him from the first. Not her beauty, which was the kind that required a second look to appreciate, but her refusal to let a thing be what someone else decided it was. She would hold an insult in her hands and turn it until she found the facet that interested her, and then she would act on that facet rather than the one that had been intended. It was a form of courage that did not look like courage. It looked like patience. It looked like a woman reading about root crops while her mother-in-law's money sat in the next room. The purse remained on the breakfast table for 11 days. Mrs. Curran laid the cloth around it each morning. James set the coffee urn to its left. The butter dish migrated slightly north. The household accommodated the purse the way it accommodated everything the Duchess had introduced quietly, without fuss, with the steady competence that Thea had cultivated in the staff, not through instruction but through example. In the servants' hall the purse was discussed once, on the second evening, and then, by silent consensus, not again. They understood it the way servants understood most things in a great house, completely without being told, and with a loyalty that expressed itself as discretion. On the fourth day, Hollis asked Mrs. Curran whether the item should be moved to the strongbox. "The Duchess has asked that it remain," Mrs. Curran said, "on the breakfast table." On the breakfast table. Hollis, who had served the old Duke and the Dowager, and now the young Duke and his wife, and who had learned that the most dangerous people in a great house were not those who shouted, but those who waited, said nothing further. On the seventh day, the Dowager sent a note. It was addressed to Benedict, written on her personal stationery, heavy cream paper, the Langdale crest, blind embossed, and it said, in its entirety, "I trust the matter has been resolved." Benedict showed it to Thea at dinner. She read it, set it beside her plate, and said, "She means, have I taken the money?" "Yes. Write back and tell her the purse is on the breakfast table, nothing more." He did. The Dowager did not reply. On the 11th day, Thea opened the purse. She did this at the breakfast table, in the morning light, with Benedict across from her reading the agricultural reports from the home farm. She loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents onto the tablecloth. Gold coins, guineas stacked and counted, precisely 300 pounds worth, spread across the white linen in a bright scatter that caught the sun and threw tiny discs of reflected light across the ceiling. Benedict lowered the report. "I have been thinking," Thea said, "about the cottages on the south boundary, the ones Mr. Hollis identified in the Michaelmas survey as requiring new roofing. The Jessup cottages and the Barnwell Row, 6 families between them. The estimate for repairs was £42. The estimate for rebuilding properly, with good stone and sound drainage, was £210. You want to use the money? I want to use her money." She looked at him. "I want to rebuild those cottages with £300, given to me by the Dowager Duchess of Worley, for the purpose of making me disappear. And I want every tenant on this estate to know who paid for their new roof." Benedict was quiet for a long time. Outside, a wood pigeon called from the copper beech that stood at the edge of the south lawn. The clock on the mantel ticked. Mrs. Curran, who had entered with fresh toast and heard enough to understand what was happening, set the rack down and withdrew without a sound. "She will be furious," Benedict said. "She will be credited," Thea replied, publicly, generously. "The Dowager Duchess's endowment for the welfare of the Worley tenantry. Mr. Hollis will oversee the work. The families will be told that their benefactor is the Dowager herself, acting from a concern for the estate that mirrors her late husband's commitment to the land. That is not what she intended. No, but it is what the money will do." It was, Benedict realized, the most complete response to an insult he had ever witnessed. Not refusal, not return, transformation. The purse that was meant to erase her would instead inscribe her, or rather, inscribe the Dowager's name on an act of generosity the Dowager had never intended to perform. The tenants would be grateful, the county would admire it, and the Dowager would be unable to object without explaining what the money had actually been for. The rebuilding began in June. Hollis engaged a mason from Olwick and a carpenter from the village, and the work proceeded through the summer with the efficiency that characterized everything Hollis touched when given clear instruction and adequate funds. The Jessup family, a widow with 4 children, the eldest, a boy of 12, who helped in the dairy, were moved to temporary quarters in the old laundry while their cottage was rebuilt. Thea visited on the second day to bring linens for the children's beds, and Mrs. Jessup, the widow, not the solicitor's possible relation, had taken Thea's hand and held it, and said nothing, because the gesture was sufficient, and Thea had understood this. She visited the site twice weekly after that, arriving in the gig with Mrs. Curran, who had begun accompanying the Duchess on estate rounds, not from duty, but from a particular attachment she would have denied if asked, and which expressed itself as a refusal to let anyone else pack the gig's hamper. The cottages rose through July and August, good gray stone, lime-washed inside, with hearths deep enough to burn peat and coal together, and chimneys that drew properly for the first time in the memory of anyone living in them. Each cottage received a new door, oak with iron hardware forged in the estate smithy. The drainage, Thea had been specific about the drainage, and Hollis had smiled privately at the specificity, because of course she had. Ran into a new culvert that emptied cleanly into the beck below the south field. The Dowager learned of the endowment in August, when Lady Colborne mentioned it at a dinner in Harriet. "Your mother-in-law's cottages," Lady Colborne said to Benedict, with the particular warmth that society reserved for acts of charity it found surprising. How generous of her. One does not always expect such attention to tenants from a woman of her generation. Benedict smiled. "She has always cared deeply for the estate," he told Thea that evening. She was sitting at her dressing table, her hair unpinned, the candlelight catching the shadows beneath her cheekbones and the new fullness at her waist that her day dress concealed. But her evening wrapper did not. She received the information with a nod that was neither triumphant nor satisfied, but simply complete, the way a ledger is complete when the final column balances. "Did she say anything?" Thea asked. "Lady Colborne? Your mother. I haven't spoken to her since May." This was true, and it was a wound, though Benedict carried it in the place where he carried most of his wounds, behind his competence, beneath his steadiness, in the private rooms of himself that only Thea had been permitted to enter. He loved his mother. He did not like her. These two facts existed simultaneously and without resolution, the way weather existed, present, ungovernable, requiring accommodation rather than correction. Thea watched him in the mirror. She knew the cost of what he had done, the Dower House visit, the ultimatum, the silence since. She knew that he had paid for his wife's dignity with his mother's presence, and that the transaction had not been made lightly, and that he would not speak of it unless she asked, and that she would not ask unless he needed her to. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and stood behind her. She took his hand and placed it on her waist where the child was, where the future was, where the purse could not reach. The Dowager came to Worley Court in October. She came without announcement, in the late afternoon, when the light was amber and low, and the house smelled of beeswax and the last of the garden roses that Mrs. Curran had placed in the hall. She came alone, no solicitor, no lady's maid, no Jessup. She came in a day dress of dove-gray wool, and a bonnet she had owned for 4 years, and she stood in the entrance hall and asked James if the Duchess was at home. Mrs. Curran, who had seen the Dowager's carriage from the kitchen window, had already sent word upstairs. By the time the Dowager was shown to the morning room, Thea was seated, not from haste, but because she was 6 months along now, and the child sat low, and her back ached in a way that made rising from chairs a negotiation rather than a movement. She gestured to the chair opposite. The Dowager sat. She looked at Thea's waist, then at her face, then at the window, where the south lawn stretched to the tree line, and beyond it, the new roofs of the Jessup cottages were visible against the October sky, pale stone, bright in the afternoon light. "The cottages are soundly built," the Dowager remarked. "Mr. Hollis had hired competent men. I never intended the money for cottages. No. I intended it for them." She paused, her gloved hands folded, utterly still in her lap. She was a woman who had spent 61 years knowing with absolute certainty what she intended, and for that precision to falter now was a reckoning in itself. "You know what I intended?" "Yes, and you used it for roofing, for drainage, for new hearths. The Barnwell chimneys hadn't drawn properly in 12 years. The Dowager's gaze drifted to her daughter-in-law. She looked at Thea for a long time, longer than she'd ever looked at her before, longer than at the wedding, when she had scrutinized Thea's gown for flaws, finding none because Thea's mother, 3 years dead by then, had chosen the silk herself, and the dressmaker and Harriet had honored that choice with painstaking care. Longer than at the reception that followed, where she had watched Thea manage the table with a composure the Dowager had mistaken for blankness rather than skill. Longer, even, than in all the 14 months since, when her glances at Thea had been brief, just long enough to confirm what she already believed. "The county believes I am generous," the Dowager stated. "The county believes you care about the estate your husband built. I care about the estate my husband built. Then we agree on that, at least." A subtle shift played across the Dowager's face. It wasn't warmth. Warmth would come later, much later, in small, grudging increments, like spring arriving in the north. But it was a movement, a fissure in the surface, like ice cracking not from force, but from the slow persistence of water beneath. She looked again at Thea's waist. When January comes, perhaps late December, a winter child, the dowager's voice carried a note that might have been memory. Benedict had been a winter child. He had arrived during a snowstorm, the doctor's carriage hopelessly stuck in the lane. The dowager had delivered him herself, with only Mrs. Nan, the housekeeper of that era, beside her, counting the agonizing minutes between contractions while the wind howled, driving snow against the windows. She had never told Benedict. She had never told anyone. It was one of the many things she carried alone, because carrying burdens alone was what she understood strength to be. And it had taken her 61 years to arrive at a morning room where a young woman demonstrated a different kind of fortitude. "I should like to be here," the dowager said. "When the child arrives, if you would permit it." Thea looked at her mother-in-law. She saw the gloved hands folded in the lap, the bonnet worn for years, the face that was, in another register, Benedict's face. The same jawline, the same slate blue eyes, the same tendency to set the mouth firmly when the emotions beneath were anything but. She thought of the purse on the breakfast table. She thought of the 11 days. She thought of the gold scattering across white linen like something finally set free. "I would welcome it," Thea said. The dowager left before dinner. She did not embrace Thea. She did not apologize. She was not, and never would be, a woman who apologized. And Thea, who understood this, did not require it. What she required, what she had always required, from the first morning she had arrived at Worley Court as a bride and found the dowager's silence waiting for her like an impending storm, was acknowledgment, not of her worth, but of her presence. Of the fact that she was here and staying, and that the breakfast table was hers now. The child arrived in the early hours of December 29th, while snow fell silently across the park. The house was quiet, save for the distinct sounds of labor. Mrs. Curran heating water, the midwife's steady voice. Thea's controlled breathing, which broke only twice, each time recovering with a determination that made Mrs. Curran weep privately in the corridor afterward. Not from worry, but from recognition. Benedict stood in the hall outside the bedchamber. Hollis brought him brandy at midnight, which he did not drink, and coffee at 3, which he did. He sat in a chair that had belonged to his father, in a corridor that smelled of beeswax and lavender, listening to the sounds from behind the closed door. He thought about purses and cottages and the woman inside that room who had taken 300 pounds meant to destroy her and transform them into 6 families with sound roofs over their heads. At 20 minutes to 4, Mrs. Curran opened the door. Her eyes were red, her cap askew, and she was smiling. "A son, Your Grace." The dowager arrived the following afternoon. She brought a christening gown, Belgian lace yellowed with age, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled of lavender and cedar. It had been Benedict's. Before him, his father's. Before that, his grandfather's, who had been the first duke and who had built the east wing of the house, the south wall of the garden, and the library where Thea sometimes sat, reading about drainage, crop rotation, and the responsibilities of land. She placed it on the bed beside Thea and the child. "His name?" she asked. "George," Thea replied, "after your husband." The dowager's hand flew to her mouth. It stayed there for 3 seconds. Thea counted, because she still counted things in the dowager's presence, though the habit had lost its vigilance and become something closer to tenderness. Then she lowered her hand and looked at her grandson, who slept with the absolute commitment to slumber that only the newly born possess. "He has the Langdale jaw," she said. "He has his father's appetite," Thea replied. "He hasn't stopped eating since he arrived." The dowager made a sound. It might have been a laugh. It was small, unpracticed, and over quickly, but it was there. Mrs. Curran heard it from the doorway, and Hollis heard about it from Mrs. Curran that evening. Neither of them mentioned it again, because some things in a great house were too fragile to survive repetition. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was the beginning of a corridor that both women would walk for years, slowly, with setbacks and silences, and occasional returns to the formal coldness that was the dowager's native climate. But the corridor existed now. It had a direction. It had been paid for. 300 pounds in gold, converted to stone and mortar and sound chimneys, converted again into something that had no price, no drawstring, and could not be set on a table and refused. On the first anniversary of the breakfast, Thea came downstairs to find a single rose from the Dower House garden on her plate. No card, no note. She didn't need one. She sat down, spread her napkin, and ate her eggs. They arrive here like a purse set down and left to speak for itself whenever they are.